Thank you for coming today. I know that some folks are still grabbing food and a seat, but we are going to get started. My name is Amanda Lyons. I'm the Executive Director of the Human Rights Center here at the Law School, and it is really a privilege to have you all here on campus with us today. Today's event is one of several that we're hosting and many others that are happening on campus and around the community to commemorate what's known as International Human Rights Day, which is celebrated around the world in different ways, marking the drafting and adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And for us at the Human Rights Center, we celebrate it every year. We commemorate it every year because it's also the official anniversary of the founding of our center. Professor David Weisbrot founded the center on Human Rights Day in 1988. And so for us, it's a nice occasion to come together to reflect on the history of the center, but especially to look forward. And we're really grateful to Margaret Huang for joining us on this occasion. And I think for the conversations over the past couple of days and joining our community here in Minnesota as we think about the juncture that we're at and what human rights means in that context. And we have a lot of thank yous because a lot of the faces that I'm seeing here are really important parts of the Human Rights Center. The center is the faculty, the students, our alumni, our partners that engage in the center's mission and work. And so we're indebted to all of you. We have a great conversation planned for this hour, and I'm going to kick it off by inviting Regent Robin Gulley to come up. Regent Gulley is one of the most tireless and dedicated public servants that I know. She has far too many roles for me to actually list here, but in addition to her service to the university and the state as a regent, she's an educator at the Minnesota AFL-CIO. She's the founder and director of the New Brookwood Labor College, and she's a city councilwoman in West St. Paul. She's also an alumna of the Humphrey School, a Human Rights Center fellow alumna, and a very dear friend. So please join me in welcoming Robin Gulley.
Thank you so much, Amanda, and good afternoon, everyone. And thank you so much for inviting me here. As a regent and alumna of the University of Minnesota's Humphrey School, it's an honor to be part of this celebration of International Human Rights Day and to welcome Margaret Huang to the University of Minnesota. I'd also like to extend a very warm welcome to everyone who's here today and to Dean McGivern and the Human Rights Center for the invitation to say a few on behalf of the Board of Regents. It's been my honor to long have been connected with the Human Rights Center here at the University of Minnesota and to the whole University of Minnesota's human rights community. I came into relationship with the center through the University of Minnesota's amazing human rights faculty. At the time, Melanie Ellen, Barb Fry, and David Weisbrot. And when I graduated from the university, I was fortunate to earn a fellowship from the Human Rights Center to advocate for U.S. support for child protection in South Sudan. My work today is closer to home, but like so many who have relationships with the center, it's deeply grounded in human rights every single day. The work of the Human Rights Center epitomizes the University of Minnesota's tripartite mission of research, teaching, and outreach. The Human Rights Center was one of the first of its kind, and it connects our university faculty, staff, and the diverse community around us and our partners to advance solutions to some of our most pressing problems here in Minnesota and around the world. The Human Rights Center does engage research and teaching with students and is at the cutting edge of international law and human rights. Its far-reaching impact here at the center has garnered an international reputation for rigorous research, dedicated teaching, and meaningful support of the human rights community locally, nationally, and globally. And since its founding in 1988, it has been an anchor of the exceptional and multidisciplinary human rights community, not only here at the law school, but across the university, the Twin Cities, and around the world. The University of Minnesota students here benefit from the unique programming and transformational research and hands-on experiential learning and professional development in human rights and international law that the center provides. Thank you all so much for taking time from your schedules to be here today. And with that, I'm going to pass it to Professor Nealon.
I have to say it's so great to be in a room full of human rights people at this time and to be celebrating Human Rights Week at the law school with all of you. So as faculty director of the Human Rights Centre, on behalf of Amanda, who's the executive director, and myself, we are really pleased to be hosting this unique event. Today we do two things. We launch our strategic plan, and so this is one of the things we're doing. And it's a strategic framework that we've set in for the next 5 years ahead of us, 2024 to 2027. And really, it sets out a way for us to do what we think is important, strategic, and necessary human rights work locally, right here in the Twin Cities and Minnesota, also nationally, and of course, globally. It is an absolutely exceptional honor to have Margaret Huang join us today to launch the plan, but also to give this guest lecture at a critical time for human rights here at home and internationally. And I don't think Amanda and I could have imagined months ago when we were writing this plan and we were inviting Margaret to come, how important it would be for us all to gather and how important it is for us all to think strategically about the next 4 years and what we do. Our Human Rights Centre, as we've said, was established by my predecessor, David Weisbrod, over 3 decades ago. And it's a centre that's fundamentally committed to advancing justice and equality. We have 2 key imperatives. The first is really forging new frontiers for human rights law and practice. And let me tell you, in the next 4 years, we're going to be doing a lot of forging because there are going to be big, huge challenges for us all to face. And the second imperative is our mission and our mandate is fundamentally dedicated to a focus on solidarity, on allyship with the most under-resourced, marginalized, and threatened scholars, advocates, and communities, both here at home, nationally, and globally. And fundamentally, our goal is to ensure that the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, every single part of it, is made realized and full for every right, for every person, and everywhere. So with that vision in mind, I want to introduce you to one of our foremost human rights leaders in the country, Margaret Huang. Margaret's been a friend for over 30 years. We met as baby human rights advocates. But it is an extraordinary privilege to introduce her as the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Southern Poverty Law Centre and its lobbying arm, the SPLC Action Fund. Margaret has been an exceptional advocate for rights and racial justice. She leads the SPLC in its mission to serve as a catalyst for racial justice in the South, for dismantling white supremacy, for strengthening intersectional movements across the country, and advancing human rights for all. Margaret's from Tennessee, so she works both at home and beyond home in this work. And she's led several organizations during her time, including serving as executive director of Amnesty International. And Margaret is also going to give us a lecture, but is going to then be in conversation with one of my colleagues and friend, Professor Chris Roberts of law school, who's also affiliated member at the Department of Sociology. And Chris's work is really at the intersection of public policy, human rights, international law, and legal history. And I highly recommend his book, The Contentious History of the International Bill of Rights, the Bill of International Human Rights, as a starter to understanding the very contentious history of human rights in this country. So many months ago, as I said, we started on this process of reflection, and it is just extraordinary that at this moment, post this election, that this conversation is taking place. We are likely to face unprecedented assaults on human rights. And so as we come together as a community of tolerance, of solidarity, we come to be prepared for the difficult assaults ahead on our democracy and the rule of law. And so this conversation starts with Margaret, whom I think is going to help us prepare for the road ahead. Margaret.
Hi, y'all. Good afternoon. It is Southern tradition that we call and respond. I'll try it again. Good afternoon. It's a great pleasure to be with all of you today. And it's an honor to be part of launching the new strategic plan for the Human Rights Center. It's very true that we are going to need institutions like the Human Rights Center at the forefront of our efforts over the next several years. So I'm grateful to be here and joining all of you, and I am very grateful to them for the work that you all lead. Before we begin, I know that not everyone in the room may be familiar with the Southern Poverty Law Center, so I'd like to share a short video that will give you an overview of our history and the mission that we have adopted to promote civil and human rights across the Deep South and beyond. Let me start there.
In June of 1969, 2 Black children walked into their local YMCA in Montgomery, Alabama, to enroll in summer camp. They were turned away because of their race. Like other cities across the Deep South in the 1960s, Montgomery closed swimming pools, parks, and playgrounds rather than follow court orders to integrate them. The YMCA helped fill the city's recreational needs, but continued to segregate children based on race. That's when our co-founders sued and later won. The court ruled that the YMCA must end its policy of racial discrimination. The case laid the foundation for the Southern Poverty Law Center, becoming a bellwether of our cases to come. While the nation celebrated passage of landmark civil rights laws in the 1950s and the 1960s, the promise of these laws did not always guarantee real protection in people's lives. Resistance to progress was strong. Racial discrimination and violence cast long shadows in the South. Black, brown, Asian, and indigenous people, and others historically pushed to the margins, were still excluded from good jobs, adequate housing, quality education, and other opportunities. And they had little recourse to demand justice. Our co-founders, Joe Levin and Morris Dees, sought to change that. In 1971, they formally incorporated the Southern Poverty Law Center and named civil rights leader Julian Bond as president. In the decades that followed, we took on cases that few others at the time were willing to pursue. Cases that tested civil rights laws, held powerful institutions accountable, and challenged and even bankrupted the most hateful organizations found. SPLC also launched programs to prevent hate from taking root in the first place. Today, that legacy of fighting for racial equity and civil rights in the Deep South is more important than at any time in modern history. Extremists are growing bolder and have pushed white supremacist ideology back into the mainstream. Lawmakers and the courts are reversing progress and rescinding rights that were once thought to be unassailable, like the right to bodily autonomy and the right to vote. This moment demands action. It demands that we act within our collective power to make change. That's why, under new leadership, the Southern Poverty Law Center is building power for a multiracial, inclusive democracy to ensure the promise of equal justice is real for all. Alongside our litigation efforts, we are leading transformational change through community organizing and outreach, policy advocacy, tracking and reporting on hate and extremism, and shaping narrative. And we're living into our values through 4 priority areas: strengthening democracy and civic engagement, relegating white supremacy out of the mainstream, decarcerating and decriminalizing communities of color, and eradicating poverty. At the heart of this evolution are the communities we work alongside and the region we call home. We're embracing more fully than ever our roots in the Deep South. We have opened state offices, starting in Mississippi and Alabama, to serve as connection points between SPLC and the communities we seek to serve, and to lift up community voices, needs, and priorities. Together, we're organizing for racial equity and shifting power to Black and brown people in the South. Even while looking to the future, we remain grounded in the past. So much of our nation's progress on racial justice in the last century has been born out of Black leadership and activism. and the ongoing civil rights movement, especially in the South. We honor that history. We are inspired by that history. And as we look to the future, we embrace the powerful lesson that history holds. When we transform the South, we transform the nation. Join us.
So you can see why I'm really proud to work for this organization. I have served as president and CEO of the Southern Poverty Law Center for nearly 5 years. And in this role, I am inspired every day by my colleagues who are so deeply committed to pursuing equal rights under the law. I also share their concerns about the state of human rights in the country and the threats to progress that we are likely to experience in the next 4 years. Today, hate and extremism are on the rise. Just this past October, the annual FBI report on hate crime statistics counted the highest number of hate-based crimes ever since they started collecting data in 1990. At the same time, white supremacist ideology is being mainstreamed and amplified through social media platforms, which has the potential to reverberate for generations to come. Our state houses, especially in the Deep South, are relentlessly targeting the rights of Black people and other people of color, LGBTQ+ communities, immigrants, women, people with disabilities, and Indigenous peoples, and many others pushed to the margins. The staggering level of wealth disparities and income inequality in the United States has also allowed actors to weaponize economic pain against some of our most vulnerable communities, while they simultaneously push for policies that will exacerbate that suffering. While the last 75 years of American history have witnessed progress in advancing human rights for all, today we still see many challenges. So as we prepare for an administration that holds very little respect for international norms, it might be helpful to understand how we got here and how we fought previous efforts to restrict human rights here at home. The champions of the civil rights movement sought equal protection under the law through litigation, through organizing and protest, and even by engaging with the newly formed United Nations. Despite much violence and many losses, they persevered and achieved significant progress. How were they able to accomplish this? Importantly, they used the tools of democracy, freedom of assembly, independent journalism, and of course, the right to vote, to make these changes real. And today, there are important lessons to pull from that experience. So let's begin by understanding why advocates in the US chose a civil rights framework at a time when the world was actually defining international human rights and adopting laws to actually hold governments accountable. I want to acknowledge the historian and author, Dr. Carol Anderson, whose research and writing her book, Eyes Off the Prize, have really influenced my thinking on this. And if you're unfamiliar with her work, I highly recommend the book and her other writing as well. Shortly after the Allies declared victory in World War II, countries around the world heralded the end of the war as a triumph for democracy and a blow to fascism. Black veterans returning from Europe, however, experienced a very different homecoming than other white veterans, especially in the South. Their heroism was met with brutal violence, lynchings, and Jim Crow. They had risked and lost lives to defend democracy and human rights abroad, only to have them viciously denied on their own soil. And they wanted justice, equality, and freedom without delay. So Black veterans in the South registered to vote. They refused to be relegated to the back of the bus, the back of the line, or the back of civil society. White Southerners were enraged by these bold claims of equality, and as horrific reports of beatings, maimings, and lynchings of Black Americans and veterans reached leaders of the NAACP and other Black freedom groups, they implored the federal government to act. But even as they pushed for anti-lynching legislation and legal intervention by the White House and the Department of Justice, they knew such actions would not be enough to allow Black Americans to live safely, freely, and with dignity. Meanwhile, negotiations in San Francisco over the establishment of the United Nations Charter sought to ensure that the horrors of the Holocaust and World War II would never happen again. After the earlier League of Nations had failed to prevent another world war, many countries called for a new body to secure international peace and cooperation among nations. But as US leaders negotiated over the founding charter, they made it clear that they wanted an institution with no teeth and no real enforcement power to ensure that racial apartheid within US borders would not be investigated by an international institution. Black leaders like Walter White of the NAACP and W.E.B. Du Bois closely followed the deliberations because they understood how interconnected the liberation of Black Americans was with the liberation of colonized and oppressed people worldwide. Alarmed by the continuing massacres in the Deep South, US Black leaders tried to petition the UN directly. Historian Herbert Aptheker drafted an 8-page report detailing the nightmare of white supremacy that Black Americans were forced to endure. W.E.B. Du Bois, pictured here, then submitted a lengthy legal treatise to the UN that outlined the institution's obligation to intervene to protect human rights in the US. Sadly, their efforts were thwarted because of opposition led by Eleanor Roosevelt, who threatened to leave the NAACP board of directors if they pushed this claim. After the UN refused to accept the NAACP petition, American politicians started claiming that human rights complaints were engineered by communists. Black leaders were forced to abandon a human rights strategy altogether. And that's when they turned to achieving a much more narrow scope of civil rights. The push for civil rights and racial equality drew on a wide variety of tactics, including legal challenges to segregation, community organizing, and direct action through boycotts, protests, sit-ins, and marches, with Southern Black communities at the center of the movement. Early legal wins to desegregate public schools and end racial segregation on public transportation were met with backlash, violence, and terrorism. And yet, the movement's courageous foot soldiers carried on, risking their freedom, their livelihood, and their lives for the promise of equal protection under law. Central to their demands was securing the right to vote. In his Give Us the Ballot speech in 1957, Dr. Martin Luther King decried the denial of the right to vote as a tragic betrayal of the highest mandates of our democratic tradition, calling on the government to finally allow Black people to truly live as democratic citizens. But it would take state violence against civil rights activists to win the right to vote. In March of 1965, as John Lewis and other volunteers marched across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, local state troopers responded with violence and attack dogs, resulting in many injuries in front of the press and the media. People across the country grew outraged. And just a few months later, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed. The VRA outlawed discriminatory voting practices such as literary tests, which were used in many Southern states to suppress the Black vote. The law also required that jurisdictions with a history of voting discrimination had to pre-clear any new voting rules with the Federal Department of Justice before they could be implemented. The VRA was a monumental victory for all Americans. In 1970, 5 years after the passage of the VRA, nearly as many Black Americans were registered to vote in Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, Louisiana, North and South Carolina as had been registered the entire century before. So, why do we focus on human rights? The leaders of the civil rights movement understood that the right to vote could fundamentally change the conditions of Black Americans and many others. They recognized that real change required building political power and using the power of the vote to demand accountability. Civil rights leader and our first president of SPLC, Julian Bond, explained that while the movement had won the lunch counter seat, won the bus station bench, the integrated toilet, and the vote, wielding the power of that vote as a collective would be a tool for further, more meaningful gains, the gains that fill bellies and build homes and schools. We can attribute many of the subsequent successes of the civil rights movement to the VRA. So where does that leave the domestic human rights movement today? Unfortunately, we have seen many new challenges to human rights over the last couple of decades, at the same time that we have witnessed growing attacks on the right to vote. In particular, the Supreme Court decision in 2013 in Shelby County versus Holder eviscerated the provisions of the VRA and allowed local and state governments to enact new restrictions on votes. For the states where the Southern Poverty Law Center works, Alabama, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, and Mississippi, all very easy places to work, all were required by the VRA to get pre-clearance from the Department of Justice before the Shelby decision, and all have enacted new restrictive voting laws since 2013. It's clear that the democratic system is insufficient to fully protect human rights. But can we protect human rights in a multiracial, diverse democracy without a democracy? While the United Nations and other international institutions do not champion a specific model of government, there are multiple claims by international bodies that democracy, development, and respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms are interdependent and mutually reinforcing. Starting with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted by the UN in 1948, Article 21 states that everyone has the right to take part in the government of his or her country, directly or through freely chosen representatives, and that the will of the people shall be the basis for government authority. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights also recognize that rights are enhanced in a democratic society. The UN and other human rights organizations argue that giving people a say in decision-making ensures greater accountability and responsiveness from governments and elected leaders. They also highlight that states that have embraced democratic processes typically see increased prosperity that can create a more equitable and safe society. And there's strong evidence to back up these claims. The Varieties of Democracy Institute at the University of Gothenburg issued the Case for Democracy report in March of 2023. And it highlights a number of positive findings about countries with democratic government. For example, democratization leads to economic growth, on average, a 20% higher GDP per capita after 25 years. It leads to better population health. Transition to democracy increases life expectancy by 3% within 10 years of regime change. It opens up greater access to education for children, increasing secondary education enrollment by almost 70%. It also promotes gender equality, with a proportion of women in government cabinets almost 6 percentage points higher in democracies than in autocracies. And yet, a 2022 survey of 19 advanced economies conducted by the Pew Research Center found that almost half of respondents around the world were unsatisfied with the way that democracy worked in their country. And as you can see here, the United States ranked as the 4th least satisfied of these countries, with more than 70% of American respondents saying that our country does not allow people like them to have an influence on politics. While the US has historically preached the importance of democratic government to other countries, it's clear that many US residents are dissatisfied with our own country's practices. So how does the US measure up in an evaluation? Let's do a little test. Let's take 5 elements that have been identified by the UN Human Rights Council, as well as used by the US Agency for International Development, as the essential factors for democracy. And let's do a little evaluation ourselves. So the first factor, does the US hold free and fair elections with peaceful transfers of power? That kind of sums it up. In truth, up until January 6th of 2021, I think most of us would argue that our elections were generally free and fair. And regardless of whether we agreed with the outcomes of those elections, in any given year, the democratic process largely worked, even during challenging times like the Civil War. However, the insurrection attempt in 2021 has had serious consequences for our democracy, particularly in light of the re-election of Donald Trump. As the president-elect continues to deny that he lost the 2020 election, his insistence on the big lie continues to be used as justification for other schemes to subvert the will of the people. His and others' continued attacks on the 2020 elections have undermined confidence in the democratic system and spurred many efforts to further restrict and discourage voting. Factor 2, is every citizen given the right to vote without discrimination? And are the electoral laws designed to enable people to participate in the voting process? Here, the answer is a pretty quick no. The Shelby v. Holder decision allowed numerous discriminatory laws to be enacted. And according to the Brennan Center for Justice, states have enacted at least 114 restrictive voting laws designed to make voter registration more difficult, prevent early voting, shut down polling places, and limit voter assistance. In fact, in 2024 alone, more than 300 restrictive bills were considered in state legislatures across the country. Many of the early laws that cropped up in the wake of Shelby v. Holder specifically attempted to create strict voter ID requirements that disproportionately target voters of color, low-income voters, voters with disabilities, while numerous states more recently have taken aim at voting by mail. We also have to acknowledge that partisan gerrymandering creates challenges to fair representation. States across the country are intentionally drawing voting maps that skew the ability of voters to choose someone who reflects their views and their values, while protecting the power of incumbent politicians. Again, the Brennan Center reports that actually only 1 in 10 districts in the country were competitive in the 2024 election. Factor number 3, do US policies enable individuals and organizations to freely criticize the government and participate in public debate? The ability for citizens and institutions to criticize our government, particularly when it is engaged in abuses of power, is a fundamental requirement for accountability. And yet, just in the last few weeks, we have seen the House of Representatives pass dangerous legislation that would strip tax-exempt status from any organization that is designated as, quote, supporting terrorism, without defining what that is. Under the legislation, the government would not have to provide evidence to support the designation or due process to allow the organizations to defend themselves against allegations. This blatant attempt to stifle dissent by effectively shutting down organizations is anti-democratic and threatens the vital work of many nonprofits, including my own, the SPLC. The threat is exacerbated by recent statements from the president-elect promising to deploy active duty troops to stop citizens from protesting. Factor number 4, does the US support independent journalism and the media? Well, the US has actually been a long champion of independent journalism, providing an example to the rest of the world about the power of the pen. For the last several years, however, many elected officials have labeled unflattering news reports as fake news, and they try to undercut legitimate journalism that keeps our country informed and holds leaders to account. The claims have been exacerbated by foreign governments and other bad actors who bombard the US with false news reports and on social media platforms. Unfortunately, the attacks are working. In this recent Gallup survey, 36% of Americans say they have no confidence in the media at all. More recently, the president-elect has threatened to imprison journalists and to strip television networks of their broadcasting licenses in retribution for negative coverage. The erosion of trust in the media puts us in a precarious situation where Americans can't decipher the truth from alternative facts, and where we live in different realities, where conspiracy theorists and agitators can capitalize on the electorate's instinct to mistrust to push disinformation. And finally, factor 5, is there a clear separation of powers and an independent judiciary that requires every person to respect the rule of law? Again, we're seeing a little backsliding going on. In July, the Supreme Court decision in Trump v. United States granted broad immunity for official acts, essentially placing the president above the law. Moreover, the Constitution's advice and consent process, which gives the Senate the power to review and confirm presidential nominations, including cabinet appointments and judges, this important check on the executive branch seeks to ensure that knowledgeable and qualified people will lead those agencies and courts. But the incoming president has, again, announced his intentions to bypass the constitutional review process and have his nominees approved through recess appointments. If we don't have leaders, particularly in the judiciary, that inspire confidence in their ability to fairly interpret the law, we may lose our faith in and turn away from the judicial system altogether. So, in our little test, how did the US do? So I don't want you to lose heart about the state of democracy in the country. In truth, I believe so much is possible because of our democracy. The reality is that, like any other democratic country in the world, ours is imperfect. It is very messy. And though it faces serious threats that will test our commitment to democratic values, it's worth fighting for. To create a more inclusive, multiracial democracy that respects the human rights of all individuals, we have to engage in the democratic process. We have to follow Julian Bond's call to build political power through collective action. And we have to draw inspiration from the blueprint created by the leaders of the civil rights movement, who risked everything to show us how to effectively fight for our rights and freedoms in spite of threats. We at the SPLC continue that fight today. Our litigation team is challenging voter suppression efforts across the South and even winning sometimes. And although the judicial system faces serious challenges today, they still offer an important avenue for relief and for protection of voting rights, one that we will continue to use. We will also engage with international human rights mechanisms, something that's fairly new for the SPLC, to document human rights violations as independent voices about the US human rights record. That will be more important than ever. To protect the right to vote, we need more people to use their right. And this year, we launched a civic education and engagement campaign called The South's Got Now, Decidimos in Spanish language. This was designed to educate and energize the younger generation of voters to fight for the human rights issues that they care about: affordable education and housing, access to healthcare, safe drinking water, and reproductive justice, and so much more. I'm proud to say that our teams were able to connect with hundreds of thousands of voters across the South this election season. And this engagement will help us build a foundation for future transformative change in the South. Lastly, democracy requires an educated electorate to participate and engage. In the last few years, state legislators in the South have sought to enact hundreds of bills to impose ignorance in schools and to block the truthful teaching of history. It is imperative for the health of our communities and our democracy that we protect public education, build inclusive learning environments, and continue to promote the importance of accurate history in public memory. Democracy is never going to be perfect. In the struggle for power, elected officials and political parties will always attempt to silence dissent. And the will of the people may not always align with what we believe to be fair and just for all communities. But the fight for a multiracial, inclusive democracy is a battle for human rights. When we compare democracy to all other forms of government across the globe, it's clear that democracies take better care of their people. So how do we move forward? Marian Wright Edelman told us what to do. If you don't like the world is, you change it. You have an obligation to change it, and you have to do it one step at a time. I invite all of you here today to step forward with the SPLC and all of the champions of human rights as we continue to use our collective voices to demand human rights for all. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. It is really a privilege and an honor to be able to lead this discussion with an audience that is filled with people who are on board with human rights, which is not necessarily something that you can take for granted this day and age. And so thank you all for coming, and thank you for an engaging talk. And I'm going to jump right into it and ask you to play a game with me. I'm a historian, and one of the things that I like to do, in addition to looking to the past, is to imagine myself 50 or 100 years in the future, looking back in the past to today, and thinking to myself, what are the things that 50 years ago, in 2024, they just missed? How could they have missed that? How could they not have seen that coming? But they sure rose to the challenge. So I'm wondering, in 100 years, what might people look back and say, they missed the ball on that one, and they regrouped and rose to the challenge?
So it won't surprise any of you to know that in the Deep South, there's a lot of awareness of the disdain that people in other parts of the country have for the South. People blame the South for racism. They blame the South for slavery. No, those things have. And there's a typical disdain for the ability of the South to change their circumstances. So I am counting on 100 years from now, the South transforming, and the South is going to become the progressive leader region of our country. As the demographic changes are happening in our country, the South is leading the way. There are already more children of color being born in the South than white children. In the next 10 to 20 years, people of color will have the opportunity to have a majority vote in ways that are not conceivable right now. What will they do with it? We want to build a progressive regime that places human rights at the center. And I believe that the South will make that happen. And in 100 years, people will wish that they were living in the South so that they could enjoy the kind of opportunities and prosperity that we'll see. A little idealistic, but I am doing human rights work. Come on.
When I began my research into human rights, international and domestic, one of the things that I would say with great confidence was human rights are things that we discuss about countries elsewhere in the world, but we don't talk about human rights at home. That has changed. And you're talking a lot about human rights. What's that shift from civil rights to human rights? What does it mean for us in this room?
Well, you've probably heard some of the criticisms already coming from members of Congress that talking about rights is something that comes. And that was the very effective strategy in the last century to force activists who were pushing for equal rights to turn away from human rights. Why we have pursued this very narrow focus on civil rights. But when you talk to people, particularly poor people in this country, They recognize that rights should be bigger than the definition of civil rights. They believe that economic rights, social rights are as important as civil and political rights. And so using the language of human rights is something that resonates with all types of communities and motivates them to think differently about what their expectations are from government. So the idea of challenging ourselves to use human rights language, not necessarily human rights laws, which are still very unhelpful in litigation, but using human rights language can actually transform the way people's expectations about their own rights matters. And so we're focused on building out a more educated community that understands why human rights are what we're fighting for, not just civil rights.
I had a chance to collect a few questions from students before the event, and the student, whose name is Michaela, wanted me to ask you, are the same rules how you engage in rights conflicts still present when we're talking now about hate groups that are carrying AR-15s? What does your organization do? What do students do when it seems that the rules and the risks have changed fairly dramatically over the past several years?
Well, the one thing to remember is we've been tracking hate and extremism for 35 years, that they've always been there. It is not that this is a new phenomenon. The numbers of people who are buying into it have definitely changed. The embrace of hateful ideology by a political party has changed. But the existence of the ideology. What is important is that we think about who holds those groups accountable for hateful acts. Hate speech is still permitted in the United States. And I'm pretty American. I struggle with the idea of limiting speech just because it's hateful. But hateful acts are things that we should be taking. That's where we turn to government. We expect government to do something, to regulate, to prosecute, to manage problems that are caused by hateful ideology. And when government is responsive, government is functioning as it is supposed to. The challenge for us is we have a government that now is aligned with the ideology. It's going to make it much harder to demand action and accountability from government enforcement and others. That's really the big challenge for us. On the other hand, in the South, we are used to working with government agencies that have no regard for human rights. So this is kind of just the same old for us. And we'll have to get creative. We'll have to think about new ways of challenging those kinds of behaviors and activities, using new things that we probably haven't thought of yet. All of you could help. That would be great.
Over the history of our country, we have seen how political conflicts often leave their marks on human bodies. So go back to slavery times, where it was the whip, and during the civil rights movement, dogs and water cans. What do we need to be thinking about?
You pick the subject that makes. I think it's going to be really important that women are not the only ones fighting for women's rights. For every woman in this room, there are men who love you and whom you love, and we need them to stand up and help lead this fight. We keep expecting the victims of hate or hateful activity to defend themselves. That's true with racism, and that's true with sexism, and that's true with all kinds of isms. It is not on them or on us alone to do that. So the most important thing, which again goes back to the strategic center, is to build solidarity and to see the ways in which attacks on one group actually are the very same thing as attacks on your group. That's what we really need. It is going to be vital that we not allow some of the most fundamental Christian nationalist impulse in the new administration to set back women's rights. We've heard the threat to overturn the 19th Amendment and deny women. We've heard the threat to prevent anyone from accessing. We've heard other threats to make sure that women are not given economic opportunities that men should have first priority. Yes, women, we will all fight this, and we need everybody to be part of that struggle.
This next question is from a student named Matt. He said to me, Professor Roberts, we often organize around conflict. We often organize around problems, things we don't like, but how do we organize around hope?
That's a great question. And actually, every movement needs hope. Even in the darkest days of the civil rights movement or the women's suffrage movement or any of the other movements that have succeeded, there were people who believed it could happen and it was worth fighting for it. The next 4 years are going to be really challenging. We'll have plenty to organize around that will be very concrete steps to take. But we have to remind ourselves of why, and we have to share stories of wins. That's really vital in any. So the why can be individual and can be collective. Why do we all collectively care about human rights in this room? We all know people who are going to be deeply by the incoming administration. We should be standing together to fight for them first and then ourselves as we go forward. But also remind the people that you're aligned with what has worked in the past. Where have we seen people beat the odds? What are the stories, the biographies you should be reading right now to take strength from people who've gone through so much worse? And that's a great inspiration. Organize around that hope.
Give us some inspiration with the story of a win.
Oh, sure. So I'll tell you my favorite story about supporting an American activist to utilize the international human rights mechanisms of the UN. Because most typically, we don't always get a lot of concrete wins going to New York or Geneva. We raise issues, we talk about them, we give them visibility. But in this case, there was actually a really big win. And it involves the Chicago Police Department and the story of John Burge. Anybody in here know that story? So John Burge was a police commander who'd spent time in Vietnam and learned different ways to torture prisoners and interrogate them. When he came back to the United States, of course, he became a police officer, and he decided to use those strategies against men that he was accusing of committing quite terrible crimes. He only used them against Black men, and he managed to put away more than 110 Black defendants who did not commit the crimes they were accused, because he tortured them into confessing. Once this story became clear and the Chicago city officials could no longer deny that he was allowed to resign with his full pension, and he moved to Florida to live the good life. Lawyers and representing the men who were still in jail at that point had to do a lot of work to try to get the city to address this wrong that had been done. And the city refused. And then the state refused. And the federal Department of Justice would not file suit because of, we don't have a torture statute in the United States. The criminal statutes had already expired and could no longer. So they went to Geneva, and they went to the Committee Against Torture, and they presented what had happened, including bringing one of the men who had served time in jail. And the committee was appalled. And they told the United States government that they expected them to come back in 6 months and tell them how they had provided remedy. Well, you had a bunch of State Department officials calling the mayor in Chicago saying, "What are you doing about this case?" And the mayor was saying, "Why are you calling me? What is the State Department's interest in this?" They also got the media to do front page stories for probably a month in Chicago about what an outlier this was in the international community and how these international human rights experts were excoriating the city of Chicago. Lots of things happened, but the amazing news is that the defendants and the lawyers who represent them were able to actually secure reparations for those men. It's the first time that the word reparations was used in the agreement by a US government agency. You are absolutely right. I'm sorry, and I was trying to place it on the men themselves, who were the most amazing spokespeople on this, but you're absolutely right. It was community leaders who led that fight. And that resulted in the most amazing package of reparations. So in addition to financial compensation for the men who had been put away, their families were also offered city support services, including housing, education, and other support services for free for life. They were also given a memorial in the middle of the city to commemorate what had happened to them. And my personal favorite, there was a curriculum developed that is now taught in every Chicago school about the torture committed by the Chicago City Police and how they had to make reparations. It's extraordinary. Now, it happened because of the community members, because of the men who spoke out for a whole variety of reasons. It wasn't just that they went to Geneva. But that visit to Geneva and the international scrutiny that it brought is what many folks attribute the change in opportunity for the activism. So I really hope we'll see more of that kind of activity as we move forward.
Thank you for that story and that inspiration. And now that we are so inspired, what can we in this room do when we walk out of the auditorium today?
Yeah.
What can we do tomorrow? What can we do in the months ahead?
So the first thing is to get active in your local community. Join community meetings. Hear from other residents and other community members what really matters. Really focus on civic engagement. We don't do enough of it in this country. We've taken it for granted. That means making sure people are registered to vote, but even more importantly, that they understand what's at stake and why they have to vote. So get involved in voting rights, in voter engagement, wherever you are. Make sure you're also texting your family and friends to do this. And lastly, you're always welcome to check out our website, which I would be remiss if I didn't share, which is www.splcenter.org, and find other ways that you can get involved or support our work or new ideas for things for you to try. Thank you all so much for the time.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. I always have the worst job of ending the best conversations. Just to say really quickly, big thank you to Margaret. We thought of the Southern Poverty Law Center for this commemoration many months ago, especially because of the work that you're doing at these intersections, the presence that you have at the international level and how you're leveraging it in movements at the local level. In other countries, we see that much more smoothly and obvious how to move between those layers. And in the US, it's a bigger challenge. And thanks to Chris for the great conversations and your students. Just to say really, really briefly, what we have outside is a little postcard about the strategic plan. So if you want to grab one, you can get the link to read it in full. And I would just ask you to take a look at it. It's a living document, to say the least. And we'd love to get your feedback and your reactions and comments and engagement with that document. Something that stood out for me in the process that we really felt strongly is like, what is the center, right? And it's this, right now we're stewarding this mission and this kind of vehicle that started long before us. That's been a vehicle for a lot of us in the room. And we're kind of stewarding it, but it's not ours, obviously. It's law schools, it's the universities, it's the human rights movements, and it's the state of Minnesota. So we want it to be a vehicle and a resource for all of you that are moved and committed to the same shared mission. And so a big invitation to all of you to do that, and a thank you for all of you that are very actively doing that. I think Abby is putting fires out, faraway fires, but thank you to Abby Nelson for all the work putting together this event and the whole week, and our law school colleagues. So thank you all. It's really a treat to see you, and it feels very energizing. So thank you. Thanks, everybody. And the conversation will continue.